appears we're missing some boost. Today at Speedy's Garage, we're going to try to solve the mystery of the missing boost in Project SportRunner. So follow along and let's see what we find. But first, let's get some tunes, and then we're going to have to play musical cars.
Today at 10 p.m. Eastern.
Okay, lately I had noticed when driving the 4Runner here that it wasn't having the oomph that I was used to it having, especially after putting that 2.1 inch pulley on the truck. So I started looking into some things to try to figure out what was going on, and as you saw, it doesn't seem like it's making the maximum boost that it should be. I'm only seeing about 8 pounds, and that pulley should be making, I would say 9 or 10 maybe even. Now it is summertime, so it's gonna make a little bit less. I don't know if you realize, but hot air doesn't compress as much as cold air, so you don't get as much boost when it's hot out as you do when it's cold out. So that's one thing to consider, but I still feel like that pulley should be making more, so we're gonna try to take a look and see what we can figure out. So superchargers are pulley driven, as you probably realize, and I've probably mentioned before. So basically this belt goes down around the crank pulley, and as the engine makes RPM and turns, it spins the supercharger. The supercharger puts boost into the motor. We've got a bypass valve back here in the back that stays open until a certain, or I should say a lessened amount of vacuum is realized. So when you start pressing down on the throttle and the vacuum is less on the engine, that closes. That allows all the air and the boost to go into your motor. So my first suspicion is something is loose on the belt, and that does feel, I'm able to move that with my hand. Look at that. So that shouldn't happen. That tensioner should be putting quite a bit of pressure against that belt. That's not happening. I suspect we're getting some belt slip, so let's see if we got any residue. And we do. So looks like we're getting belt slip. So this tensioner has been on this truck since I put the supercharger on, and I know that's been at least 10 years. So I suspect that tensioner has gone bad, and it's just not giving us the tension it's supposed to have on that belt, and that's allowing it to spin on this pulley. Something else I'm seeing, I don't know if you can see it or not, try to zoom in. Looks like the tensioner has actually come over and smacked the dipstick, so that's another indicator that the spring in that tensioner has probably had enough, so we need to get another one. Now you may also be asking, what about replacing the belt? Well, I replaced the belt about 9,000 miles ago, and it still should be good, and it looks like it is. The ribs and everything look fine. They're not worn down or anything strange. I don't see any cracking. So I'm just gonna go with the tensioner for now, and hopefully that'll fix our problem. Okay, so I'm gonna hop on the internets and see if I can find the part number for that dynamic tensioner. Now keep in mind, if you have that type of supercharger on your vehicle, or on your 4Runner or Tacoma, the 3.4 liter TRD supercharger, it came with 2 different tensioners through its development cycle. The original was a bolt-on static tensioner that had a bracket and some other stuff. They eventually changed over to a dynamic tensioner, which is a better solution because it's got a spring in it, and as the belts wear and other things occur, the spring will keep that tensioner putting the proper tension against the belt. So you want the dynamic one. It's also less expensive, so switch over to that if you have the opportunity. So we're going to look for that part number, and I'm going to go look for TRD supercharger dynamic tensioner. Okay, we found it pretty quick. So the part number, if you need one of these, is PTR30-35041. I'm not gonna tell you where I'm getting mine. You can Google it and find it pretty quick. It's like the second or third link. The tensioner itself is less than $50. Looks like it's about 47 bucks. We're gonna go ahead and add that to the shopping cart and place our order. There we go. Hopefully it won't take too long to get here. Let's see who's here. Oh! Sweet. That was fast. All right, let's check it out. Am I the only one that likes a really sharp pocket knife? More on that later. All right, that's what we needed right there. New pulley and everything. Now we're gonna get it installed. All right, to get this done, I'm just gonna need a couple of easy tools. We're gonna need a 17mm socket. I'm gonna use my breaker bar to release the tension on the pulley that's on there. And I'm gonna use my motorized ratchet. Finally, oops, wrong drawer. We're gonna need a torque wrench. That one ought to do it. And hopefully this will be easy peasy. Okay, I'm gonna start by putting our breaker bar, and it's a 3/8. There's a notch in the top of the tensioner. That was way too easy. I'm almost 99% sure this is our problem. Now I'm gonna remove the 17mm bolt that holds the tensioner. May have to wiggle the fan a little bit to get out of your way. Okay, I've got the bolt pretty loose. The tensioner is resting against the dipstick. So I'm gonna take some tension off of that, see if that doesn't let it loosen up. Watch your fingers when you're doing this, obviously. That didn't work. So, I'm gonna think about this a minute. Okay, it felt like it was wanting to bind up a little bit. So I went and removed the 10mm bolt from the bracket that holds the dipstick against the alternator there. We're gonna see if that gives us a little bit more room. Oh yeah, that's better. So with the dipstick bolted up, it just doesn't let the tensioner rest on its stop, and it was putting it in a bind, so way easier now. And there we go. And when you're doing something like this, even though the part numbers say they should be the same, you want to do a visual inspection to make absolutely sure. You can see the tabs in the same spot on both. Obviously there's a little bit difference in the housing, but that won't matter. Bottom line is the pulleys are the same size, the centers are in the same spot, bolt holes line up, everything else looks good. So we're going to put the new one on. I highly recommend putting a little bit of anti-seize on this bolt. This is the bolt that holds the dynamic tensioner on. Obviously you're putting a steel bolt into aluminum and other pieces of steel, so putting a little bit of anti-seize on there is always a good idea for if you have to take it off again in the future, it won't seize up. Now we've just put the bolt through the pulley, and installation is just the reverse of removal. Make sure the belt is behind the pulley, that's important. You want to make sure you line the tab up in the bracket. And you know you got that when it locks into place. Now we just want to tighten down the bolt. And now you want to come in and torque that bolt to 40 foot-pounds. Then we'll use our breaker bar to reset the belt. Oh wow, yeah, that one's got quite a bit more tension on it than the one I took off, so it was definitely worn. Make sure your belt lines up with your alternator, it lines up with your supercharger pulley, as well as your fan belt over here, or fan pulley rather. Okay, so with just the new tensioner in place, you remember before I was just barely pushing on this belt and the tensioner was moving. Well, now I'm pushing on it pretty good and the tensioner is not moving. So I can tell there's quite a bit more tension on there with that new tensioner. As a little extra measure, since this is a 2.1 pulley, it's pretty small, I'm also going to go in here and I'm going to adjust the alternator just slightly to kind of, there's a bolt down here that you turn and it pulls the alternator back away from the motor, and it'll put a little bit more tension on the belt as well. So I'm going to do that too, just as a little extra tension on that pulley. Don't forget to reinstall your 10mm bolt that holds the dipstick, and don't over tighten it. I'm going to use a stubby ratchet on it to make sure. You can break that, it's just 10mm, so be careful with that. There are 3 bolts that hold the alternator in place. You've got a pivot bolt here, you've got a lock nut which is underneath, you can't see it, And you've got the adjustment, which is on the right hand side. It's also underneath. You can't see that either. So 2 of the 3 are kind of blind bolts. So we're gonna do the best we can. I'll try to describe it to you and show it to you, but you're not gonna be able to see much, unfortunately. We'll start with fighting with this one. I could probably take this belt off, but the point is I want the belt to be tensioned by the alternator. So I'm gonna try to leave it in place. The lower bolt's a 12 millimeter, and I'm gonna use a 3-inch extension to make it clear the alternator. This is the lock nut. Okay, now we can start running the adjuster, and it's a 12 millimeter bolt, so I'm going to use a ratcheting wrench on it. Now if we were doing this professionally, there's a tool they make that clips onto the belt and it'll pull on it and it gives you a tension measurement. I don't have one, so I'm going to kind of do it by feel. I want it to have about a 1/2 inch to 3/8 inches of deflection at the midpoint. I'm close. Give it a couple more turns for good measure. I think we're good. You don't want it too tight because it'll pull on the pulleys. Not good for the bearings, and it'll also wear the belt out faster. That feels pretty good there. So I'm gonna go with that. Hope we solved our problem, and I'm gonna come back and tighten down the pivot nut and the lock nut. I'm gonna start with the lock nut, and the torque spec is 25 foot-pounds. Next, I'm gonna hit the pivot bolt, and it's 38 foot-pounds. Okay, that feels quite a bit better. So now I'm gonna fire it up, make sure everything tracks straight, and then we're gonna go for a test drive and see if we found our missing boost. And I wanted to use a second point of reference for the boost, so I've connected up to the Underdog Racing 7th injector controller. It reads boost. I'm gonna run a data log on it through the laptop, and that way I can compare it to what we see on the boost gauge when we go and do our test drive. Okay, so I took a look at the maintenance log for this vehicle, and I put that supercharger on about 70,000 miles ago, so that tensioner had right at 70,000 miles on it, or maybe even a little bit more, and I can already tell a difference in throttle response just going down the road. So we're gonna head to our closed circuit test track to test this out and make sure we got our problem solved, but I think we did. Okay, and we can confirm that we are not seeing any belt slip. So that problem is solved. There's no more residue on the supercharger snout. I've put a few miles on it now, so we're good to go there. Okay, so we saw 9.2 or 9.3 pounds of boost on the water meth injection boost gauge. We saw 10 pounds of boost in our data log, so I think we've got our problem solved. We only picked up about a 1/2 pound of boost according to the gauge, or almost a pound of boost, I guess you should say, according to the gauge. However, I expected this thing to make 10 pounds of boost with that 2.1 pulley in hot air, and that's exactly what we're seeing. The truck feels better, the throttle response is better. I think the belt slip was kicking in, you know, a lot when I would get on the throttle initially. It was spinning a little bit maybe as it wound up, and the throttle response is back like I expect it to be, or like I remember it being, and so everything is much happier. So we definitely needed to get that dynamic tensioner replaced and go ahead and tighten up the belt a little bit using that alternator adjustment bolt. So we're good to go now. I'd be curious if that's what you're seeing with a 2.1 pulley on a similar setup, so leave me a comment, let me know how much boost you see in various temperatures. I want to go back when the weather cools off and retest this to see how much boost it actually makes. I believe it should make over 10, closer to 11 actually, so maybe the supercharger it's just not doing a good enough job coping with the heat of summer because it's a non-intercooled unit. I don't know. Let me know what you see. I'd be really curious about that, so please leave me a comment if you have a similar setup. And if you liked what you saw, be sure to hit subscribe in the bottom right hand corner. Click the bell so you get notified when we produce new content. Check us out on our website, www.speedysgarage.net, and hit us up on Instagram @speedys_garage, and hopefully I'll see you out there.